Alright, hello everybody. We are doing something I think pretty fun today, which is going to be a tier ranking of Brandon Sanderson's books as a whole. Now, on the channel in the past month, I've had a little bit of a hot and cold relationship with Sanderson that has been mostly cold. If you haven't seen yet, I did a rant review of Oathbringer, the third book in the Stormlight Archive, and then I started Rhythm of War, which is the fourth book in the Stormlight Archive, just came out in November, and DNF'd it after 200 pages. Now, DNF might be a little extreme because I do plan on coming back to it at some point, but I was just really burnt out on that series in particular and thought I wasn't able to give it a really fair chance to present itself to me because I was just having a tough time with the series and the prose and a lot of different things involved here. Since my channel is kind of new, unfortunately a lot of my Sanderson content is very negative. I do actually like Sanderson as an author. I'm wearing my fantasy author's sweatshirt, and you'll notice Sanderson is on the list. So I obviously like him as an author. I think he is a good storyteller and a much better storyteller than an author. And so that would be really fun to do this tier ranking of all of Brandon Sanderson's books, talk about some of the things I really like about his writing style, the books that I really like, especially as I am going to start doing more reviews of his books in the future. So, also, let me assure you guys that all of this is going to be spoiler free, so no matter what you've read or haven't read in the Sanderson pantheon, feel free to watch this video. I'm only going to talk broadly about synopses and things that happen in the book, really just like it's the back of the book, to see if you would like to read it. So don't worry about spoilers. Let's start out this tier ranking video. Now, I have not prepped for this as far as like where I'm going to put things at all. I literally had the idea for this video this morning, and now I'm starting it. So no idea where this is going to go. First off, Evil Librarians, I have not read that. We'll move on. Same with Alcatraz. Now, unfortunately, the first one on the list is going to be Oathbringer, and you guys know my thoughts on that. For me, it's interesting, some of the stuff that it does in the world, and there's some good moments, but for the most part, just felt like a slog. I was struggling through it. I'd be interested in maybe like 4 or 5 years if I ever reread it, if it'll be better, because it's not going to come right after reading the other books in the Stormlight Archive in the same year. But overall, really didn't like Oathbringer. Again, I did a whole 20-minute rant on that, so I'm not going to say much more than that. Now we're going to get into some interesting stuff, which is the stuff that's not talked about a whole ton on Fantasy BookTube, but I think are actually quite good books, and that is the Steelheart trilogy. Okay, here we go. For some reason they have Steelheart way down here. I'm going to do Steelheart first because it's the first one in that series. I really enjoyed this series, and I am going to come up here and put Steelheart in. You guys ready for this? It is going to go in A tier. I really enjoy it. One of my huge critiques of Sanderson as an author is that he writes in sort of a YA style prose, and his tone is very YA. And so I tend, and you'll see in this ranking, I tend to really favor stories that are more consistent with that writing style in the story that he tells. So there are some really tough, sort of brutal moments in Steelheart. If you haven't heard of Steelheart, it's kind of like a superhero. It's not kind of. It is a superhero story where all of a sudden people on Earth start getting superpowers. It's not part of the Cosmere, I don't think, because in our world, they're in Chicago, if I remember correctly. And they don't know, this star in the sky appears called Calamity. They called it Calamity, and that causes certain people to get superpowers, and it's mainly like bad people, and so they like basically turn the world into like a bunch of tyrant states around these really powerful beings. And the guy who rules Chicago and most of the United States is a guy called Steelheart, which is basically bad Superman. It's really well done. It's really interesting. It is simple in the best possible way, and like I said, I really enjoy that. So I'd highly recommend this series if you like Sanderson, or if that premise sounds good to you. I actually think he does quite a good job, and like I said, it's a lot of the positives of what I like in Sanderson's storytelling and his simple prose. I think done well. So Steelheart, I think, is the best in the series. Firefight, the second one, moves to a different arena, which I did not like as much as the first, so I'm going to put it down in here in B. And then the third one had a good ending at points, but also had a somewhat unsatisfactory ending. So I'm going to kind of put them just A, B, C right there. That's kind of my gut. I would still recommend the series as a whole. And actually, the whole series as a whole, I'd probably put in an A tier for just doing like series, because I really enjoyed that. Now let's get to Mistborn, potentially my favorite from Sanderson. The first one I think is great. Spends a lot of fun time with the magic system. Pretty well covered how cool this is. If you haven't heard of it, it's basically there are 8 different metals and you can consume them, and they call burn them, and that will give you power. Not everyone can do this, only people called Mistborns. They can burn all 8, which each metal gives you a different power. It's just written really well, really uniquely, and the world is unique, but it doesn't have the same sort of downfall, in my opinion, that the Stormlight Archive have, where it gets a little too bogged down in this world, where Sanderson sort of goes a little crazy in the world building department and the info dumping department and that kind of thing. It's much tighter, even though the prose are worse, because he wrote it earlier in his career, so he just has developed as a writer since then. So a little more juvenile, like in the actual like words on the page, but I think the story is much tighter, keeps the attention much better, and I just like that it's much more contained, and I think it's the only Sanderson series that's like just done. Like there's next eras coming along, and he's still like having fun with the magic and other stories, but like this story is done. First one I think is great in that it's kind of Ocean's 11-y heist like. The second one, which is called The Well of Ascension, I think is still good, but not perfect. There are definite slow patches, and there's some political intrigue that doesn't always work for me, and some character growth that doesn't always work for me. And there's one particular character that takes a lot of screen time that I don't love. Still B, still a good read, would definitely recommend it. However, I would also going to put in S tier the final book, which is The Hero of Ages. One of the boldest, craziest, unforeseen endings in a fantasy series. I love that it's bold, it's different, it feels very different. The themes are some of the deepest that Sanderson has, especially around the idea of religion, and I really enjoy that. If you're going to read any Sanderson, I always tell people the Mistborn trilogy, and in fact, I think it is potentially the most recommendable fantasy series out there because it's accessible to just about everybody the way that it's written, and it has so many elements of different genres. Like, there's a little bit of romance, there's a little, like I said, a heist film, there's some action, it's definitely fantasy, it's definitely kind of steampunky without being steampunky. I recommended the Mistborn trilogy to my mother-in-law, who doesn't read any fantasy, and she really enjoyed it, and she was like joking with me about burning metals for the next month. So like, it's a great series to recommend across genres and across different kind of readers, and I think that that's a really impressive thing to have done. So like that series. Secret History, haven't read. Now the second era of Mistborn is not the same as the first. I just don't think it's as tight. The character's not as interesting. The world is not as interesting. It's more of a Western tale on that. Pretty universally, people do not love it. The first one I thought was enjoyable. I'm going to give that a B. Alloy of Law, I remember the second one was real boring. And then honestly, third one just tries to build this whole world in what I saw as a pretty clunky way. And so I'm going to put that in D as well. I just did not like the second Mistborn era. I just think a lot of the strengths that's in that first one that I just talked about are not as strong here, and some of the weaknesses are back. A little over world building, the silly dialogue is a little much. This is trying to be very comedic, and it just doesn't work for me. What does work for me, and this might be the hottest take of this tier ranking, The Emperor's Soul, which is a short little novella. I think it's like 120 pages. Like, it's actually short, not just Sanderson short. I have it in the Arcanum Unbound collection, so I actually read the physical copy. I love The Emperor's Soul. It has a really cool magic system that's not overly explained. It is still hard, but not like in the textbook way that sometimes Sanderson does it, which get on my nerves. There's some mystery. It's so so tight. By tight, I mean like every word is really important in driving the story forward, not just the plot forward, because Sanderson likes to do plot, but the story and the person and the background and the character. I just love it. I think this is Sanderson's best to date. It's definitely S tier, and it's number 1 for me. By the way, I said it, I don't know if I said this at the beginning, but this is all relative, right? I'm judging Sanderson on Sanderson. So all these in S tier on, like, these are all, like, in my personal, like, if I was judging all fantasy books, but they're up there. And Emperor's Soul might be on a full list up there. It's a great short story novella type thing, and I would highly recommend it, even if you don't like Sanderson. I think that's kind of the best idea of, like, this guy he can write a story. Words of Radiance is my favorite Stormlight Archive book, and for whatever reason, I just can't really bring myself to put it into that top tier. I just don't like it as much. It is definitely A tier. It's my favorite Stormlight Archive. It has great moments. It misses some potential great moments and critiques, but overall, really enjoyed it. Like I said, my favorite Stormlight Archive book. A lot of good character growth. It's up there at A. Have not read this. Shadows for Silence, haven't read. I'm sorry. Haven't read Perfect State. And Evil Librarians, I always said, haven't read. Snapshot, honestly, I haven't heard of that. Haven't read it. White Sand, I'm not a huge graphic novel person. I tried to read this, but didn't make it all the way through. So it's either D or F, but I'm going to go with F because I don't think I read the whole thing. So remember, F is unread. Edge Dancer. Again, I sort of like lean towards liking shorter Sanderson and more YA Sanderson, so I think a lot of people might put this down here, but I actually am going to put it up here in this B ranking. It's a great, I shouldn't say great, it's a good read. It's a fun read, and I think it does some interesting things. I actually really like the character of Lift, so it's going to be up there, which I am sure will surprise a lot of people. White Sand, again, haven't read. And Arithmetist, haven't read, which I probably should. I've heard actually the Arithmetist is quite a good YA novel, and as I've said multiple times now, that's sort of the Sanderson style that I draw to. For the same reason, I need to read Skyward, but haven't. And again, the Alcatraz and Librarian books I have not read. Haven't read Legion. This is sort of the boring part where I go through all of these ones that I have not read. If you, in watching this tier list, are like, hey, you really need to get on that, let me know in the comments. And while you're there, subscribe and hit that bell to get notifications for my new video. Okay, we'll stop doing that now. These are more Skyward books, I believe. The Hope of Elantris, haven't read, but I should, because this next one, Elantris, I really enjoy. Now, Elantris is the first book that Sanderson ever published. So it is, in some ways, has some of those freshman mistakes that first-time authors make. Humor and the clunkiness of his dialogue is at its worst in Elantris. So just know that going in, and I think it'll be a lot better, because the actual idea behind the novel is really, really cool. The basic is there used to be this amazing civilization that made amazing things and could do incredible magic and basically created a paradise on Earth. And then all of a sudden, for some reason, all of that stopped. And the descendants of these basically godlike creatures actually became cursed. And they basically became zombies where they couldn't die, they were immortal, but they felt every pain that they were ever caused. Like they would trip on a stone and you have a stubbed toe and it hurts. But whereas our stubbed toes fade away after a little while and the body heals itself, their bodies don't heal themselves anymore, but they're still immortal. So they feel that pain all the time, and eventually it overcomes them and they just live in this awful, like, area of pain. So the way that the world is developed is there is this walled in city where everyone basically puts the zombies, and then all the regular people who are still regular people live on the outskirts of this city, and they've sort of built their own politics and world around this. And every once in a while someone new catches the disease or becomes infected or whatever it is, and they go into the town. And you basically follow the prince of this land who gets this disease and has to live with being a fantasy zombie, basically, and try to figure out what's going on. There's politics in there. There's some very interesting religious stuff, which there always is in Sanderson. So I really enjoyed Elantris, and it's a standalone. It's a one book. I think he's going to write more in it, but I really appreciate the oneness of it. It's not quite to the level of Mistborn and Emperor's Soul for me, so I'm going to put it in the A tier. But it's another one that I think isn't really talked about a whole lot in the Sanderson world, because so much of the oxygen is taken up by Stormlight Archive, but I actually think it's better than Stormlight Archive and less of a commitment. So Elantris, really, really good. 11th Metal, I read this and totally forgot what happens. So I'm going to put it in D, but that might be just because it's been a long time since I read it. So I don't really know. Put this over here. Mitosis, I believe, is in the Steelheart world. I haven't read it, so I'm just going to put it to the side, and we'll get to that later. Sixth of Dust, I haven't read that either. Way of Kings, I really enjoy Way of Kings. I think it is way overblown as far as like how popular it is, and like I tense up every time that I hear someone say that it's the best fantasy of all time, or that it shows up on like a top 5 fantasy of all time. And so I'm a little more negative about it than probably it deserves because of that, because I want to kind of push back against that. But it's a fine book. It's a good read. I'm going to put it in the B tier here. I think the Kaladin storyline is really great, really well executed. It's not like, I mean, I love long books. A lot of people talk about like, oh, it's slow and plotting. Like, I don't think so at all. I think it's really key. I think it's very interesting. But I think I've said this multiple times. The weaknesses in Sanderson that I see for me in his books are very obvious in the Stormlight Archive, because in doing this big epic series in the tone he's going for and yet not adding some of the elements that I'd like, I don't know, it makes it tough for me. So check out my reviews of those if you haven't. They're both very long, and I am much more articulate than I am here because I'm trying to be spoiler free for all of these books. Yeah, but anyway, it's going to be in the B tier for me. Good, but not great. And then finally, Warbreaker. Again, standalone Sandersons I tend to like a lot more, like Elantris and Warbreaker. And just like Elantris, I'm going to put Warbreaker in the A tier. It's not quite up there with my favorite from the Mistborn trilogy, but it's very, very good. If you haven't heard of it, the magic system is based on color and breath, and that is done very beautifully and eloquently. It's basically a story of two sisters who accidentally have to switch sides and responsibilities, so they're both sort of out of their depth and out of their usual expertise, and you see the story from both of their perspectives. That helps you understand what should be happening but then isn't happening. One sister is forced into this marriage-like thing that has a lot of layers. It's a little complicated to explain, but she's forced into this marriage with a ruler, and then another sister is part of the defense of a nation that's warring with the nation that her sister is now the queen of. I'm not going to say more than that, but it's really great, and actually it's very tied in with the whole Cosmere, if that's really your thing. I've said before, it's not really my thing, so I don't really like it for those reasons, but I know a lot of people really get into that. And again, it's a standalone. It's a great, quick, tight story, which is, I think, Sanderson's best. So that is my tier ranking of Sanderson books. I'm pretty proud of this. I knew that probably these 3 were going to be my top. The first Mistborn and the third Mistborn in the first era, both excellent, and Emperor's Soul I just absolutely adore. I think Steellight having that high is going to be surprising for a lot of people, but I really love it. I read some of that and listened to the audiobooks, really good. Words of Radiance, I think people know, are my favorite. And Elantris and Warbreaker. Again, standalone, tight Sanderson stories I really like, because I think he's a good storyteller, but sometimes he gets bogged down. And then the rest of these I think are pretty unsurprising, except for maybe Oathbringer being down low, but again, if you saw my review, you know that. Again, any of these that I haven't read based on my tier ranking, let me know if I should really pick it up. I'm going to wait a long time, obviously, to pick up some Sanderson, because I'm a little Sanderson out, but probably going to pick up Rhythm of War sometime next year. Yeah, so now you guys know what I think of Sanderson. Again, though he has some hiccups, still, I think, a great fantasy author, and especially a great storyteller. Thank you guys for watching. As always, first in, last out.